I think we can start. I can see that most of the people have entered, and I am now very delighted to introduce Thomas Platz. He will give a lecture on meta-analysis, an extremely important topic to safeguard quality in neurorehabilitation. And before he starts, I would like to say a few words about him as a person. So Thomas Platz was educated at the medical school in Heidelberg and Mannheim, and also went to Duke University in Durham. He received his medical degree in 1990 and started his residency 1 year before in 1989 in Berlin. In 1995, he received the Theodor Leinen Fellowship by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to stay at the Institute of Neurology in Queen Square, London. And in 1997, he received also a diploma in epidemiology and biostatistics from McGill University. Around that time, he also became board-certified neurologist and clinical geriatrist in Berlin. In the early 2000s, he received his habilitation degree at the Charité, where I am located now. So we are quite close to each other. It's, I think, an hour and a half, maybe 90 minutes by train. After getting his habilitation here at the Charité, he became the head of the Department for Neurorehabilitation at the BDH Clinic in Greifswald in 2006, and acts there as the medical director since 2009 and head of the department of both Neurorehabilitation Center and Spinal Cord Injury Unit. And he's also a professor at the University of Greifswald. Now, since 2018, he acts as medical director of research at the BDH Clinic in Greifswald, and he's also head of the Institute for Neurorehabilitation Evidence-Based Practice at the University of Greifswald. In addition, he leads the Neurorehabilitation Research Group at the University Medical Center Greifswald, and he's president of the German Society for Neurorehabilitation. He is one of the leading figures in neurorehabilitation, not only here in Germany, but also in Europe and on the international level. For the World Federation for Neurorehabilitation, he acts as head of the education committee and head of the special interest group Clinical Pathways. In addition, he is also liaison person for the WFNR Cochrane Rehabilitation Collaboration. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Thomas Platz once more, and I'm very looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Sokata, for this very nice introduction. And I would like to welcome our audience for today. Good that you are here. I hope you will find it useful and informative. And please, if you have any questions and comments, use the Q&A function already during the lecture. After the lecture, we would then like to address your questions and comments. And so thank you very much again for joining. Use the Q&A function if you have questions. And I would now like to thank our technical host, Christian, and would like to ask him to start the lecture, which is pre-recorded. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, this talk is about systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Here the outline of my talk. I'll talk about types of evidence for medicine. Why is it relevant? What are systematic reviews and meta-analysis? And who is involved in their generation? What are quality aspects of systematic reviews, and especially Cochrane reviews? And we'll then come to some summary and conclusion. Well, evidence-based medicine. It's not about a recipe book-like medicine, but it's really about combining clinical experience, clinical expertise with the best available evidence to inform clinical decision-making. to inform clinical decision-making in terms of how likely is an intervention and to what degree is an intervention producing a clinical benefit and does not harm. And there are various kinds of biomedical information that we could use. There are textbooks, reviews of narrative kind, case reports, observational studies, and then we have randomized controlled studies, maybe a critically appraised synopsis of best evidence synthesis of randomized controlled trials, and we have the systematic reviews. Now, the thing is, if you go from bottom to top, that you might find less information, less pieces of information, while on the other side, they are becoming methodologically more valid. And hence, we will have a higher degree of confidence in the estimates of therapeutic effects if we climb up this pyramid. And this will be, if we go to systematic reviews and meta-analyses, if they are performed properly, if they are valid, they are providing high degree confidence estimates of therapeutic effects in terms of benefit, acceptability, and harm. And even though the top of the pyramid is narrower than the base, there's still a paramount degree of evidence being available. And in neurorehabilitation over the last few decades, we have seen so many more randomized controlled trials that are relevant for our clinical decision making. And for the individual, might be clinician or healthcare provider, consumer researcher, policymaker, it's really the amount of information available is unmanageable for the individual. And here, systematic reviews and meta-analysis have a role to play because it's about identifying, appraising, and synthesizing the research-based evidence and presenting that information in an accessible format so that clinical decision-making can be backed up by the best available external evidence. Well, systematic reviews are called systematic because they are systematic in terms of the methodology used to produce them. It's about the clear set of objectives and predefined eligibility criteria for studies to be included. And the validity of those studies to be included needs to be assessed in a systematic way. The data synthesis, again, has to follow valid methodology, and the same holds true for presentation of findings and interpretation. And many might contain meta-analysis where that is possible. And this makes this difference between systematic reviews and narrative reviews. Narrative reviews do not have to be bad, but they are more subjective in nature, while systematic reviews, by strict methodological approach, can lead to more valid, more objective data and evidence for clinical decision-making. The objectives of such systematic reviews is to summarize the likely magnitude of benefit of effective treatment. So it's not always about whether treatment is beneficial, yes or no, but it's about the magnitude of benefit. And systematic reviews might help to identify treatments that are not effective. We can be more certain that they are not effective if you have more data to support and answer the question. And equally, they help to identify risk, even unanticipated risk associated with treatments and acceptability of treatment options. They give an indication about the quality of existing randomized controlled trials, identify gaps of knowledge, and help to focus research that is future research that is relevant for clinical decision making. Now, what is a meta-analysis in this context? It's a statistical method to summarize the results of independent studies. There are two major advantages to be gained. One is that by combining the data from independent study, we can reach more precise estimate of the magnitude of effect of healthcare interventions. As said, it's not always about just knowing whether it's beneficial or not. No, we want to know about the magnitude of effect. And that estimate is getting more precise with meta-analysis if you have studies to combine. And another major advantage is that you will see and you can analyze the consistency of evidence across studies. And if it was not consistent, you can explore and explain the differences and how heterogeneity all came about. So, and this is all very informative for our clinical decision making. Accordingly, the objectives of the meta-analysis are to summarize results. And sometimes you have quite a few small studies, but it's then difficult to really know about the therapeutic effect, and you can overcome small sample size by data synthesis. Sometimes you would have an outcome that requires a large sample size to really analyze, and that might be helped by a meta-analytic approach. And as I said, it's all about the differences between studies, and meta-analysis can help to explain those differences, the diversity. And the differences between studies and the results might be explained in terms of the clinical diversity that is within these studies, like different patient populations, interventions, different comparisons, different outcomes. But partially it might be related to methodological diversity, in that studies with a higher methodological validity will lead to a different estimate, a more valid but a different estimate. And this needs to be explored, analyzed, and be interpreted. And of course, knowing about all of that will then help to focus future research and maybe generate new hypotheses. Now let's have a more closer look at these meta-analyses. Now, this type of quantitative synthesis of results across studies is only meaningful if you have identified and collected those studies in a systematic way. And this is why systematic reviews and meta-analysis belong together. Usually what is combined are data from average data from individual studies, and they are then used in the meta-analysis. At times, that is beneficial and it has advantages. You can use individual participant data for meta-analysis, and then you have a more statistical options to really explore for example, modifying variables and confounding variables and the like. Mostly systematic reviews and meta-analyses are performed with randomized controlled trial data, but you could do that with observational studies as well. And that might help, again, to delineate sources of heterogeneity that might account for differences that you will find in clinical practice. Now, one way of looking at meta-analysis is that you consider themselves observational studies of evidence, kind of secondary type observational studies. And this is important because these meta-analyses, they might be influenced by confounding. There might be bias in the methods. And so it's very important. They are very prone to misleading data synthesis. So it's very important to generate meta-analysis with a very valid approach, and hence by that to produce trustworthy data synthesis. Part of that trustworthy approach is, of course, a transparent and complete way of reporting, and there are different ways of different standards to report systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Systematic reviews, meta-analysis can be conducted by individual author groups independently, but there are organizations like the Cochrane organization, like the Health Technology Assessment International, or in the US, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, that provide methodology that generates systematic reviews, and so provide this kind of high quality background and would then generate presumably trustworthy evidence. Trustworthy evidence, and this is coming back to this issue of quality aspects of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. That's ever so important. Because that's so important, I choose the Cochrane methodology to portray aspects that are relevant in this context. So yes, systematic reviews and meta-analysis are beneficial because they increase the statistical power, they can improve the precision and the estimates of magnitude of therapeutic effects. And with having more data across studies and being able to look into subgroup data, we might answer questions that we could not answer by using individual study data only. And thereby they can help to settle controversies. But like any observational study, and we said they can be looked at as kind of secondary observational studies, meta-analysis, you might think they're big data and that's valid and it's robust. No, there is a potential that they are seriously misleading because there might be biases in the data that had been used for the meta-analysis, and the systematic error would then translate to the data synthesis and might give a wrong answer to the healthcare question of interest. In addition, a meta-analysis is combining data from across studies, and one has to be cautious. This is only meaningful if the research question is comparable in those studies. So it's not meaningful to combine apple and oranges, because the information you will receive is not applying to either apples or oranges, so it's going to be meaningless. And at times, we said already, there is might be heterogeneity, there might be diversity in the data across studies. If there's a lot of heterogeneity, if there's inconsistency in the meta-analytic data, then it would be misleading to quote an average value. Again, that would not apply to an intervention. And one would have to explore and find reasons for this and explanations for this heterogeneity before one then could say, for example, for subgroups, that we have a valid, trustworthy estimate of therapeutic effect. And of course, if there's a lack of, if there's data being missed out by publication bias, negative small trials not being reported, or maybe outcomes that didn't signal a benefit, it had not been entered into the publication reporting bias. If you then use this data to run a meta-analysis and to take the estimate as being valid, so again, this might be very misleading in the end. So one has really to be very cautious and to have a very close look at the methodology that has been used. And quality aspects of Cochrane reviews are diverse. One being there are groups who reflect what are the reviewed topics that are relevant. There is a peer review for the protocol of a systematic review that really guides and guards before bias in the process of generating the systematic review and meta-analysis. It's really important the way a systematic review is set up. Its design, general design aspects. It's it's very important that you address a healthcare question that is really mimicking, resembling clinical decision-making situations. And it's very important that you define your outcomes as being clinically meaningful, that you don't only look into beneficial effects, but also address the potential for adverse events and effects of a therapeutic option. It's very important that you are up to date, that you use the best current evidence, and that you are very cautious if it comes to evidence where there's a high risk of bias, and you have to critically appraise and take that into account, both in terms of analysis being made and interpretation of the data synthesis of the meta-analysis. And those teams who are generating systematic reviews, they do need expertise in the specific field, because this critical appraisal needs clinical judgment. And at the same time, it's necessary that there is methodological expertise, so you can really produce a valid systematic review. And it would be good if you had healthcare consumers being part of the review team, or at least someone along the editorial process. And we all have to be cautious, and we need to take into consideration that situations where evidence is being applied in clinical decision making are quite diverse in terms of social economic backgrounds, and we need to take into consideration those different situations and produce evidence and evidence synthesis that is applicable in various settings. The data presented needs to be up to date, and that hence means needs to be updated because data from randomized controlled trials, for example, are accumulating, and so maybe 2 or 3 years ago was a different situation, and so the systematic review evidence needs to be up to date. And up to date is not only in terms of new research evidence becoming available, but there might be more information in terms of biomarkers or new methods to analyze the data to reach valid conclusions, and all of these various aspects need to be taken into account. Now, another important aspect is conflict of interest. So, for example, Cochrane reviews could not being sponsored by a commercial source. And conflicts of interests must be disclosed and managed accordingly. Now then, it's important to know what are the key aspects of methodology in more specific terms. And for Cochrane reviews, this is a clear description of the condition being addressed and the experimental intervention of interest and how that compares to alternative interventions. Why might it be important to ask that question and to generate such a systematic review? And then more specifically to look into the specific question being addressed in terms of participants, patients, or interventions, comparisons, and outcomes being looked at, and what is the primary objective to assess the effects of an intervention for a health condition in people having a specific disease or problem, and declare that as primary objectives and declare in advance a series of specific other objectives to be reached by the systematic review. Systematic reviews should not only look into potential benefit of an intervention, but also into the question of potential areas of harm and acceptabilities. It's important to run diverse electronic searches for eligible studies. There needs to be a specified method for selection criteria. There need to be specified methods to use to extract and obtain data from published reports, and methods to assess risk of bias and methodological quality. All that needs to be declared in advance. Further declared in advance should be stated the effect measures of choice to be used, how to deal with missing data, how to address clinical heterogeneity, how to describe and analyze publication bias or other reporting biases. Now, further, the methods for the meta-analysis should be stated in advance, together with any planned subgroup analysis of interest, so that in the end you will find that, okay, there have been declared subgroup analyses because they are clinically important, and you find the results of the same that had been declared in the protocol. So you can be sure, okay, everything that was meant to be addressed had been addressed, and you see the results. and you declare in advance analysis that you will perform to see whether the results of a meta-analysis and the conclusions are robust. For example, because you analyze any effect of risk of systematic error bias by running a second meta-analysis only with those trials that have a low risk of bias and compare the results of this meta-analysis to the result of the overall meta-analysis and see whether this is robust with regard to methodological quality of studies that have been entered to the meta-analysis. Risk of bias is very important because this leads to risk of bias might lead to systematic errors in your data. So the estimates would no longer be valid, but would be distorted in a systematic way, in a various way how this might happen. And so the typical questions that you would address in clinical trials as allocation bias, blinding, as performance or detection bias, incomplete outcome data attrition bias, selective reporting bias, and others. And it's very important that you have a systematic critical appraisal of the individual studies, whether any type of bias would be likely, how high is the risk for that bias in each individual study being entered. And by knowing this kind of matrix, by knowing this information, you then can judge how that might have affected the estimate of therapeutic effect. And if that bias was not there, how would the effect, the estimate of the effect, probably be changed? And you can just do that by reasoning, you can do that by sensitivity analysis, but it's very important to critically appraise the risk of bias first, and then look how that might play a role in the data and the evidence you collate. Finally, you would then summarize the evidence. So systematic reviews and meta-analysis are not providing practice recommendations, they're providing evidence. They go and tell you some implications for clinical practice, but our primary purpose is really to provide the evidence. And you might give indications what the implications of future research might be following the results of the systematic review. Now, the Cochrane reviews have a quite complex, standardized, uniform format, and this might help in various ways. It's a bit cumbersome to start with, but there's a lot of information and there's a lot of clarity and transparency being generated by that. And let's just briefly look at this uniform format. Structured abstract, there's a plain language summary for non-medical professionals. There's the background, the objectives, criteria for selecting studies, the results, description of the study, risk of bias included studies, effects of intervention, discussion, and the author conclusion. There's a lot of additional material that really gives you broad perspective on information. It all relates to the systematic review, its methodology and results. Here the review and the records and selection process. Here, the risk of bias assessment on the left side, you see a risk of bias assessment for each individual trial, and the risk of bias graph on the right side gives an overall view on percentages of risk of bias as low, unclear, or high category across all included studies. The funnel plot gives graphical information how smaller trials with a bigger standard error being lower in the graph contributed to the overall estimates, and to what degree, and how bigger trials with a smaller standard error contributed. What you're looking for in this graphical display is whether there is a symmetrical or asymmetrical funnel plot, and in B on the right hand side you see this unsymmetrical funnel plot where the smaller studies, which are down below, are more on one side of the overall estimate, are more on the beneficial side, and this might indicate that negative trials, smaller negative trials, had not been reported. But that leads to an overall overestimation of effect, because the overall effect is then regarded higher than it would have been if those small studies that had been negative had been published and included in the meta-analysis. But sources of asymmetry in the funnel plots might be quite diverse, might be related to publication bias, might be related to true heterogeneity, to data irregularities, or being artifactual. At any rate, if there is an asymmetrical distribution, this should warrant further explanation. As I said previously, it's important to declare in the protocol the type of estimate of therapeutic effect you plan to generate a statistic, and here common effect size indices would be standardized mean or coherence D, odds ratio, or relative risk. And so usually you would find a forest plot indicating the contribution of individual trials. Here, 3 trials contributing, the study idea, the number of events, cases in the intervention group, and the number of events of interest, and the number of participants in the control group, and then you can calculate the relative risk, and it's 95% confidence interval. Then you would have a weight. The bigger trials with a smaller standard error would have a bigger weight in the overall meta-analysis, and on the right side you would see the numerical description of the relative risk and the confidence interval, and then you would have a total, and with the total have an overall analysis of the meta-analysis. Now in the bottom line you would see a test for heterogeneity and the statistics for heterogeneity, like here the I-square, and a test for overall effect of the meta-analysis. Summary of finding tables would then, based on the PICO format, give an indication for each outcome, whether the experimental compared to the control group had a different outcome if a certain intervention was applied. The intervention here is the circuit class therapy, and the outcome is walking capacity. And indeed, those who received the circuit class therapy had a higher walking capacity at the end of intervention. And on the right-hand side, you see the quality of evidence, a category which was moderate, and an explanation that the size of the effect that you see here would be bigger than the minimally clinically important difference. So it's a clinical relevant difference that had been reported. Now, after having heard that Cochrane reviews have a quite complex methodology and their reporting is quite complex either, it's easy to see that not all published systematic reviews would have the same high standards of quality. And then if you use systematic reviews and meta-analysis for your information, for your clinical decision-making, it's then important to assess their validity. As I said previously, they can be regarded as observational study of secondary type, observational studies of evidence, and they are prone to misleading analysis and results, and so it's very important to look into the validity of the systematic reviews. And here in this book chapter that is freely available, it was methodologically based for our clinical pathways and stroke rehabilitation project. Critical appraisal questions that had been adapted from AMSTA2, it's a measurement tool to assess systematic reviews, had been provided, and so you would like to address the question whether there was a written protocol. This helps to prevent bias by changing methodology once you are under your way. Was a research question clearly phrased? What had been the study design selected? Was that adequate? Was there comprehensive literature search strategy? Had all processes been performed in duplicate? Other studies included described in adequate detail, so you would know for whom and for what situation, interventions, comparisons, the data of the meta-analysis would apply. Was there satisfactory technique for risk of bias assessment? Was the meta-analytic methodology in terms of statistical approach appropriate? Have all clinically relevant effects being addressed, not only benefit, but also long-term effects, harm and acceptability? Did the authors look into the potential impact of risk of bias in individual studies on the meta-analytic results? Did they look into the question of heterogeneity? Was there an explanation for heterogeneity, and had the results been discussed by looking into potential implications of heterogeneity? What about conflict of interest in the included trials, and what about conflict of interest among the systematic review team? And taking that all of that together, had the conclusions that had been drawn been valid and supported by the data sufficiently? So if you then have systematic review and meta-analysis, and you checked its validity, and you know about the credibility of the estimate of therapeutic effect, you have the evidence, maybe the up-to-date and trustworthy evidence that's available for a certain healthcare question. And then if you go from there to clinical decision making, it again is good to have a specific methodology, because there's still some steps to be taken from evidence to clinical practice recommendations. And here in this methods paper, I described the way to do so. That's the way that could be recommended if you use a lot of internationally agreed methodology for systematic reviews, for clinical practice recommendation and guideline development. So it could be recommended for you if you wanted to use systematic reviews for your clinical decision making, to look in addition to the systematic review and meta-analysis methodology also into the methodology that helps to bridge the way from systematic review evidence to clinical practice recommendations and clinical decision making. Okay, let me briefly summarize. High quality standards like methods used for Cochrane review, they really optimize the likelihood that the results gained will provide the best available evidence that we can use to base our decision on. And this is very valuable. And what we need to see here is a sufficiently detailed written protocol in advance, a meaningful question, a systematic search for all trials that have a chance to meet the eligibility criteria. We need to have a formal assessment of the validity of included studies, for example, with risk of bias assessment. We need to have a systematic presentation synthesis and characterization of including studies. We need to have reflection of subgroup issues and sensitivity to methodological quality. For example, looking into potential effects of risk of bias in the data. We need to keep this data up to date, and the systematic review and meta-analysis evidence should be free of conflict of interest wherever possible. And it's good to provide not only the evidence, but give implications for clinical practice and research. So that's good methodological practice for systematic reviews. We could say, as clinicians, we could say, okay, if we had such high quality, up-to-date systematic review evidence, that would be a very good starting point for us. It's a very good starting point for us, again, then with systematic methodology to develop practice recommendations and to go with the evidence into an evidence to decision process and to come to final conclusions regarding the clinical decision making. And here I stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much for this very clear and concise talk. Now I have seen the question and answer section. There are already 3 questions, and maybe we go through these questions now. The first question is, is there any available software for meta-analysis that can be freely used?
Certainly, yes. I just know about the Cochrane methods, the software that is free of charge and has been used in many systematic reviews outside the Cochrane library as a kind of a standard. I think I have used that, but I think you have to register maybe, and but then it can be used free of charge. And there might be other tools. I'm not sure about R, whether that contains statistics for meta-analysis. One could have a look at that. And so in a very specific situation that I mentioned earlier in the talk, there was the individual participant data, where you have data from several studies, but you then have not only the aggregate, the average data, but all the individual participants in that data. Then, of course, you can use your regular software package, because you have, like in a single study, you have all the individual data. But maybe you could have a look at the Cochrane library and the Cochrane sources. That's very valid, and in a way, it really has been used by many authors, and it's trustworthy. And of course, it's with this meta-analysis, it's not kind of the usual average across trials. That is tricky. You have to, there's always this weighted estimate, overall estimate, where the weight of individual studies is dependent again on the specific methodology, but by and large is dependent on the precision that is assumed for a given study. For example, if it's a big trial, will provide a more precise estimate, and that will receive a bigger weight.
Yes. Now, another question was regarding the literature search. What's the best way to select the best keywords?
Okay, so again, one could answer that in different ways. Maybe first, the less likely in terms of implementation. The best way to do it is if you're a member of a Cochrane review group, and they have specialists to do that. And I say that because it's really an important question addressed here, and it's tricky. And I have been very impressed by those people who are actually professionals in doing this kind of data search. And the type of, the approach they use is quite complex. If you look into the Cochrane reviews, you will see that at the end. It's all presented. So that's very complex. That would certainly be the best. But now let's say you would like to do that yourself. Then it's very important to go along the PICO question first. Consider what is the patient population you are considering, and how could that be operationalized in your search. Next is what is the specific intervention or group of interventions you are interested in, and how would that translate? So you need to translate you have a healthcare question to start with, and then you have to translate that in a research question, and it needs to have the format, the PICO format, with patients, interventions, the comparisons you are interested in, and very importantly, the outcomes. It's not all about good and bad, but it's about specific. Well, what is the outcome of interest you are looking at? And if you have clarified this first step from your clinical healthcare question to the PICO schema operationalization of the question, then comes the next step. And the next step, if you then go to, and that really depends on the electronic database you're looking at, the kind of filters and details of search they would allow. But in PubMed, for example, you would have the medical subject headings. So if you have your PICO schema, and if you then translated that using medical subject headings and with a Boolean logic with and or and brackets, you would then have at least a valid approach. And if you have that, if you are at that step and you use the search terms, the combination of search terms, you can then look into the sensitivity of your search. You wouldn't like to have all publications available in the world, because there's no way really to select among the eligible, the ones to be selected. On the other side, you don't want to miss out. If you miss out a lot of information, your even systematic review is not representative of the evidence. But if you have a valid term constructed to begin with, you can test it and see, okay, you might know quite a few trials already, and do they pop up? Or how many are there? Are they 50,000? Maybe too much. You can narrow down. So maybe that could be some practical hints how to approach.
Another question is, how can one become a Cochrane member or a member of a Cochrane membership?
Well, there are different ways of becoming a member of the Cochrane teams, because different teams that might be relevant for us. Okay, I mentioned the Cochrane review groups. I think there are maybe 50 or even more, and they are centered around a topic. For us in neurorehabilitation, one Cochrane group that is highly relevant is the stroke group. And the stroke review group, it's based on a topic, stroke. The stroke review group, they generate systematic reviews that are stroke related, including rehabilitation. If one wanted to become member, one would have to get in contact with the stroke review group, and there are contact people on the internet, so that would be possible. One way. Another way is there is the Cochrane rehabilitation field. So Cochrane rehabilitation field is not a Cochrane review generation team, but this is a collaboration, global, international, that wants to bring the Cochrane information to the healthcare professional. So like the WFNR is working together with the Cochrane rehabilitation field, because we have the same goal of bringing the evidence to clinical practice. So that again might be an option to consider if you had interest in this Cochrane world, and if you are more on the side of how to put it into clinical practice, you might as well get in contact with Cochrane rehabilitation. And there again, they have different subgroups depending on what you're most interested in, whether it's education or it's more methodology or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, we also had a more practical question here. When we see a funnel plot, how can we interpret it?
Right. I had shown the funnel plot. Maybe I should, I will go back there and share it. That might be the easiest way really to talk about it. I'm wondering, Christian, could you let me share my screen? Would that be possible?
Yes, just 1 second, please. Okay, please try now.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. So here, for example, we have an actual example of a funnel plot, and you see that is the electromechanical and robot-assisted gait training by Jan Meerholz and colleagues. And here what you see is estimates of individual trials. So there is a therapeutic estimate. It's about walking velocity and whether electromechanical and robotic assisted gait training plus physiotherapy will lead to a different outcome regarding walking velocity as compared to physiotherapy or usual care alone. So the combination of electromechanical gait training with physiotherapy compared to physiotherapy. And then you would have a mean difference here and the value for each individual trial that entered the meta-analysis. Now, these trials had been smaller and bigger. And if they had been smaller, then this estimate would be less precise. You don't see the precision with a circle here, but you see the precision of the estimate with the standard error here. So, like if you look at a 95% confidence interval, you would have, if a wide confidence interval tells you, okay, not so precise estimate because the error term is big. And if the error term is getting small, then you are pretty sure that within this small range, the true estimate has a 95% chance to be within this small range, narrow 95% confidence interval. And here what you see is the error, the magnitude of error in the estimate. And if it's higher, then you see this estimate being located lower on this graph. If it's higher, then the estimate will be higher. But that's the specific estimate here. It could be negative. Now, this, if it was above 0 in this example, then the gait trainer would be beneficial. If it was below, then the gait trainer would be detrimental in terms of people walking faster. Okay, that's the way to look at it. And then you look, here's another example, and then you look at the distribution. Each dot is a single trial. And this is the overall estimate of the meta-analysis. And then you look, how are they distributed on the left and right side? You see, if I go back, if the distribution around this overall estimate is just different by chance, then you would see they being symmetrically be allocated, like here on the left side. So yes, there is an overall estimate, that's here, the dashed line. And just by chance, in some trials, the estimate had been lower, and in other trials, the estimate had been higher. Okay, fine. So that's why we're doing a meta-analysis, to have a more precise overall picture. Okay, fine. And you see, if they're getting smaller, these trials, and if the error within the estimate is getting bigger, then we have more variation. If they're becoming bigger, they're getting closer to the overall estimate. No wonder. Yeah? If it was a very large trial, it would be very up close to the overall estimate. Okay, fine. That's good. And then you have a kind of a view on a very specific situation, in medical reporting, that both on the side of the researcher and on the side of the journals and reviewers, we are keen to present positive information. We are keen to present a trial where the experimental intervention produced a benefit. And so with those smaller trials, if they produce maybe even very high, you see that here, very high effect, much higher than the overall effect. So usually the first initial small trials, they popped up the signal, and by chance they had a very high, big effect. But this is not the representative, valid effect for the general population to be treated. But still they are there, and there might be valid data. Yes, okay, that's fine. But on the other side, we miss out those who had not been published. Unfortunately, the researcher thought, well, no, I can't publish that. It looks very bad. I mean, this gait trainer just made them slower. So I rather don't publish it. I don't want to publish that. Bad news, kind of. Or the reviewer finds it kind of, well, small trial might not be representative. Was the power enough? And so the conclusions drawn might not be correct. So we rather don't publish it. See, things like that. Or it might take longer to publish it. It might just take longer because people, send it back the first time and want more information. And if it's a big trial and positive, so it's much easier to get it published. And this overall might result to publication bias. And you can see that these smaller ones, they will draw this line to the right. So if there were the other side, like here, was filled, this line would more shift to the left, and the valid estimate would be smaller than the one we see. So publication bias in this example would lead to an overestimated. And then you could do a sensitivity analysis. You could take out the small ones, leave only the bigger ones that are symmetrically distributed, and see what is the effect size you will see then. And that might be a more valid estimate of the overall effect. So that's the way maybe to look at such a funnel plot.
Yes, excellent, excellent explanation. And now there are no more questions in the question and answer section, but maybe let me ask one question to maybe also underline the relevance of meta-analysis. So throughout your career, which meta-analysis has really changed or had the highest impact on how you are doing, how do you perform practice in your hospital?
That might be difficult to say, but an example is certainly the electromechanical gait trainer. And where we know from the more recent and updated, again, very important that they are updated. So we really know about the current status of affairs, where we see that the electromechanical gait trainer that's coming to the subgroup information, is most beneficial early after stroke in those who are not able to walk. And it's not really helpful with those who are already able to walk, but might be walking slowly. And later, we are less sure how much benefit we can generate in those who are still unable to walk. And this is where the meta-analysis really provides meaningful clinical decision-making information, because we learn about subgroups and we learn about specifically how many people do we have to treat with such a machine, number needed to treat. to have one more positive outcome, and you get a kind of a crisp, or you can keep it in balance. And so that would be one example where I would see that clinical decision making is really informed. But by and large, the more, maybe even more important is to see the systematic review evidence collectively. Now, for example, in this book project that I mentioned in the talk on clinical practice recommendations, stroke rehabilitation, 14 author groups around the world, special interest group leaders and groups from the World Federation Neurorehabilitation mainly. Now here, we really looked into systematic reviews across the different topics in stroke rehabilitation. And then you get really a good picture in terms, because there have been many Cochrane reviews to be used, you get a clear picture about the effects and the size of the effects and the subgroups. And I like that very much, because that really transformed into evidence-based practice recommendations. And you see the kind of limitations that are still there, but you see the kind of backing up of recommendations. And if you compare, for example, this book project with other guidelines that had been published, you would see a more fine-grained, you know, the clinical decision, it's a bit more close to the clinical decision making, because it's more detailed and is covering aspects at times more specifically. And I think this is where it all leads to, and we need to take the comprehensive knowledge from systematic reviews and meta-analysis and take these further steps to clinical practice recommendations and have this again in a scope, and then try to get that into clinical practice. So it's cumbersome, like this talk is kind of cumbersome to listen to. But the good news is there's so much to be gained from this work. It's a bit cumbersome, but in the end, it's very informative.
Well, I think that is a very good closing sentence for our webinar. So I would like to thank everyone for participation, and thank you, Thomas, for your excellent presentation and lecture, and also discussion and explanations. Thank you so much, and have a nice afternoon now.
Thank you for chairing, and our host for the technical support, audience for being with us. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.